It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Take that thing to the kitchen, Victoria Anderson snapped, her voice cutting through the elegant hum of the charity auction. You don't look like you belong at a table with the Rockefellers anyway. The words landed with the weight of a physical blow. Around them, the conversations of the city's elite died a sudden, jagged death. Victoria stood at the center of the ballroom, her silk gown shimmering under the crystal chandeliers like oil on water. She didn't just walk. She occupied space, her jasmine perfume acting as a border patrol for anyone she deemed unworthy. Emma Montgomery stood opposite her, holding a simple ceramic dish. The scent of cinnamon and baked apples was a warm, honest intrusion into the cold, sterile air of the Anderson family's annual gala. She had spent 4 hours in her kitchen, meticulously crimping the edges of the crust, thinking of the children the charity supported. She had thought, perhaps naively, that a gala centered on community might value a piece of home. It's a heritage recipe, Victoria, Emma said, her voice a calm, steady ribbon of silk. I thought a charity for hungry children might appreciate something made with actual heart. Victoria laughed, a high, brittle sound that echoed off the marble floors. Heart doesn't pay for the lighting in this ballroom, darling. Status does. And frankly, your heart is embarrassing my son. Emma turned her gaze to the man standing a half-step behind Victoria. James Anderson looked every bit the rising star of the banking world in his bespoke tuxedo, but his face was flushed with a deep, cowardly red. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He was too busy adjusting his French cuffs, his gaze fixed somewhere near the floor. Emma, for heaven's sake, James muttered, his voice a sharp, hushed blade. I told you to order something from the caterer. This isn't a church basement. Look at what everyone else brought, vintage wines, original art, jewelry, and you show up with a pie. I show up with the truth of who we are, James, she replied softly. No, he snapped, finally looking at her with a flash of genuine resentment. You show up with the truth of who you are, a kindergarten teacher who doesn't understand the room she's in. Near the buffet, Rachel Anderson stood with her knuckles white as she gripped a champagne flute. She looked at Emma, her eyes wide with a mixture of pity and a strange, flickering terror. Rachel was the only one who had ever been to Emma's private study in their shared summer home. She was the only one who had seen the black card statements and the legal documents from Sterling's office that Emma usually kept under lock and key. Rachel opened her mouth as if to speak, to perhaps warn her mother to tread lightly, but the sheer force of Victoria's arrogance silenced her. Victoria reached out, her manicured fingers, tipped with diamonds that cost more than a teacher's annual salary, flicking the edge of the ceramic dish. With a casual, practiced cruelty, she nudged the server Emma held. The ceramic hit the floor with a dull, sickening thud. The pie shattered, cinnamon-scented filling splattering across the hem of Emma's modest navy dress. The golden crust, so carefully prepared, lay ruined in the dust of the polished marble. Oops, Victoria whispered, though her eyes were alight with predatory triumph. It looks like the trash has found its home. James, dear, do be a love and tell the staff to bring a mop. We can't have Harrison Rockefeller slipping on. Whatever that is. Emma didn't move. She didn't look at the mess on her shoes or the stains on her dress. She felt the coldness of the room, the way the witnesses, the board members, the socialites, the friends, all shifted their weight, turning their backs to the humiliation. They were sharks sensing blood, and in their world, Emma was the bait. Clean it up, Emma, James said, his voice devoid of any warmth. Before the guests of honor arrive, you've done enough damage for one night. He turned his back on her, following his mother toward the VIP lounge. Emma stood alone in the center of the room, the smell of burnt sugar and broken pottery rising around her like a funeral pyre. She felt the weight of 5 years of playing nice. 5 years of letting Victoria belittle her and James ignore her, all because she had wanted a quiet life away from the cutthroat world of her inheritance. She reached into the small, beaded clutch at her waist. Her fingers brushed against a heavy, cold object, a simple-looking signet ring that bore the Montgomery crest, a symbol that could freeze the assets of half the people in this room with a single phone call. Her phone vibrated. A single notification glowed on the screen. Michael Sterling, the final signatures are verified. The Anderson Holdings debt has been consolidated under your private equity firm. You are now the primary creditor for their family estate, their firm, and this very building. Shall I initiate the foreclosure protocols? Emma Montgomery looked up. She watched Victoria laughing with a group of investors, gesturing grandly with a glass of vintage crystal. She watched James leaning in to whisper a joke to a senior partner, his posture that of a man who thought he was untouchable. She didn't feel rage. She felt a profound, icy clarity. Emma tapped a quick reply to the message. Wait. I want them to feel the height of the mountain before I take the ground from under them. Is everything ready for the board meeting on Tuesday? The reply was instantaneous. Everything is prepared. They won't know what hit them. Emma tucked the phone away. She didn't call for a mop. She didn't look for a napkin. She walked toward the exit, her head held high, leaving the shattered remains of her heart on the floor for them to walk over. She caught Rachel's eye as she passed. The younger woman looked at the stain on Emma's dress, then at the expression on Emma's face. Rachel's glass trembled, the champagne sloshing over the rim. She saw it then. The sleeping lion had finally stopped pretending to be a lamb. "Emma," Rachel whispered, a plea for mercy she hadn't yet earned. Emma didn't stop. She didn't look back. She had 3 days to prepare, and by the time Harrison Rockefeller arrived at the board meeting on Tuesday, the Anderson family would realize that the woman they had treated like a servant was actually the one who held their lives in the palm of her hand. The game was no longer about a pie. It was about the poison they had served her for years, and Emma Montgomery was about to make them swallow every last drop. The scent of expensive mahogany and old parchment filled Michael Sterling's office, a stark contrast to the sugary, suffocating smell of the Anderson household. Emma sat in the plush leather chair, her fingers tracing the hem of her modest wool coat. She hadn't slept, but her eyes were clear, the exhaustion replaced by a cold, vibrating clarity that felt sharper than any blade. "The paperwork is finalized, Emma," Michael said, sliding a heavy silver fountain pen toward her. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of a man who moved mountains with a signature. "By Tuesday morning, the majority share of Anderson Holdings will be transferred to your private trust. They have no idea you've been the silent partner keeping their lifestyle afloat for the last 3 years." Emma Montgomery took the pen. The metal was cool against her skin, a tactile reminder of the power she had spent years concealing. "They think I'm a charity case, Michael. Victoria spent 20 minutes yesterday explaining why I wasn't refined enough to use her heirloom silver." She signed the document with a sharp, decisive stroke. "Let them keep their silver. I'll take the house it sits in." Her phone buzzed on the desk, the vibration rattling against the wood. The caller ID flashed a name that made the air in the room feel thin. She answered, putting it on speaker. "Emma, I hope you've spent the morning reflecting on your behavior." Victoria Anderson's voice shrilled through the line, dripping with the casual cruelty of someone who had never known a consequence. "The cleaning crew just left. The stain your little accident left on the Persian rug is going to cost $4,000 to treat. I expect a check on my vanity by tonight. And don't think you're coming to the Rockefeller gala. I've already told James to tell the guards you aren't on the list." "I'm at work, Victoria," she said, her voice a flat line. "Work? Oh, that little schoolhouse. Please, you're a glorified babysitter. James is right here, and he agrees. Your presence is becoming a liability to our social standing." "Emma, just do what she says," James Anderson joined in, his voice sounding tired and annoyed. "You're making this into a thing. Just pay the bill and stay out of sight for a few days. Mom's stressed about the Rockefeller meeting on Tuesday. We can't have you causing another scene when the future of the company is on the line." Emma looked at Michael, who was already pulling up the Anderson family's debt portfolio on his monitor. The numbers were staggering. Loans taken against properties they didn't realize they no longer fully owned, lifestyle expenses funded by credit lines she personally guaranteed. "I'll see you on Tuesday, James." she said softly. Not if security sees you first, Victoria snapped before the line went dead. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the office air conditioning. Emma stood, smoothing her coat. She felt the weight of the digital keys in her pocket, the access codes to every account the Andersons called their own. They had spent years treating her like the dirt beneath their designer heels, never realizing she was the foundation they were standing on. 48 hours, Michael noted, checking his watch. 48 hours, she repeated. She walked toward the door, her reflection in the glass partition showing a woman who was no longer hiding. The countdown had begun, and Victoria was about to find out that the rug she was so worried about was the only thing she'd have left to stand on. She stepped out into the crisp morning air, the sound of her heels clicking against the pavement with a new, rhythmic authority. She didn't head toward the school. Instead, she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Harrison, it's Emma Montgomery. I believe we have a board meeting on Tuesday. I'll be attending as the majority shareholder. I'd like to keep it a surprise for the current management. The voice on the other end was warm, respectful. It would be an honor, Emma. I've been wondering when you'd finally step into the light. She hung up and looked at the time. 2 days. 2 days until the Anderson family realized that the woman they had dismissed as a servant was actually the one holding the deed to their lives. She caught her reflection in a shop window and smiled. It wasn't the smile of a kindergarten teacher. It was the smile of a woman who had just finished building a cage, and all she had to do now was wait for the occupants to walk inside. The heavy oak door of the corner office swung shut with a muffled thud, sealing out the frantic hum of the city. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of expensive espresso and the metallic tang of a high-end printer. Michael Sterling didn't rise from his desk. He simply slid a thick, charcoal-colored folder across the polished mahogany surface. "It's done," Michael said, his voice as sharp and precise as his pinstriped suit. "Every signature is verified. Every loophole is welded shut." The Anderson family has spent the last 3 years leveraging assets they no longer technically own to maintain their lifestyle. They've been playing a shell game with a master, and they didn't even know you were at the table. Emma Montgomery reached out, her fingers grazing the embossed gold seal on the top document. The paper felt heavy, substantial, the physical weight of 5 years of patience. She flipped the page, her eyes scanning the bank statements Michael had flagged. The numbers were staggering. Victoria had been funneling corporate funds into her personal charity foundation to pay for her designer wardrobe and European retreats. It wasn't just arrogance, it was embezzlement. Harrison Rockefeller has already confirmed the schedule for Tuesday, Michael continued, leaning back. His eyes held a predatory glint that matched Emma's own internal resolve. The board thinks they're meeting to discuss a new round of funding. They have no idea they're meeting their new landlord. Emma tucked the folder into her bag. "And the house." "The deed is in the second tab," he replied. "Technically, you could change the locks tonight, but I suspect you want them to be dressed in their Sunday best when the floor drops out." A cold, thin smile touched her lips. "I want them to have something to lose first." The drive back to the Anderson estate felt different this time. The long, winding driveway lined with manicured hedges no longer felt like a path to a prison. It felt like an inspection of her property. When she stepped into the foyer, the sound of her modest heels on the marble floor was immediately drowned out by Victoria's shrill laughter. Victoria Anderson was draped over a velvet chaise in the drawing room, a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and a jeweler's loupe in the other. James Anderson stood by the window, looking bored, while Rachel Anderson sat in the corner, nursing a drink and looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. "Oh, look who's back from her little schoolhouse," Victoria sneered, not even looking up from the diamond tennis bracelet she was inspecting. "Emma, dear, don't just stand there like a statue. The caterers for tomorrow's pre-board dinner sent over the sample menus, and they're on the hall table. Go through them and make sure there's nothing pedestrian. I won't have the Rockefellers thinking we eat like public servants." The air in the room was thick with Victoria's perfume, a cloying, floral scent that cost more per ounce than Emma's monthly mortgage. Emma didn't move toward the table. She stayed in the doorway, her hand resting on the strap of her bag, feeling the hard edge of the folder inside. "I think the menus are the least of your worries, Victoria," Emma said quietly. Victoria froze, the loop dropping an inch. She turned her head slowly, her eyes narrowing with a venomous intensity. "Excuse me. Did the finger painting today go to your head? You are a guest in this house by the grace of my son's pity. You don't offer opinions, you offer service." James finally turned from the window, his expression one of weary annoyance. "Emma, just do what she says. Don't start a scene. We have a very important few days ahead of us. My mother is stressed enough trying to secure the family's future." "Your future," Emma repeated, the irony tasting like copper in her mouth. She looked at James, seeing the man she had once thought she loved, now reduced to a pale imitation of his mother's greed. "You're right, James. The next 48 hours are going to be very important for this family." Victoria stood up, the silk of her robe hissing against the chaise. She walked toward Emma, her heels clicking like a countdown. She stopped just inches away, using her height to try and intimidate. "You don't get it, do you? You're a footnote. A mistake James made that we're finally correcting. After the board meeting on Tuesday, we're moving forward with the expansion. There won't be room for a kindergarten teacher in our new social circle. I've already drafted the separation papers. You'll get a modest settlement, provided you leave quietly." Emma felt a surge of adrenaline, but she kept her breathing steady. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single, small slip of paper, not the deed, but a receipt Michael had found. It was for a necklace Victoria had purchased using the company's emergency reserve fund. "Is this the expansion you're talking about?" Emma asked, holding the paper up. Victoria snatched it, her face flushing a mottled red as she recognized the document. Her hand trembled, but she quickly masked it with a sneer. "This is business, Emma, something you couldn't possibly comprehend. This is how the world works for people like us. We take what we want, and we let people like you sweep up the crumbs." She crumpled the receipt and tossed it at Emma's feet. "Now, go check those menus. And then go to your room. I don't want to see your face for the rest of the evening. You're dismissed." Emma looked down at the crumpled paper on the floor, then back at Victoria's triumphant, arrogant face. The rage was there, a white-hot flame, but it was controlled. She didn't pick up the paper. She didn't argue. "Tuesday," Emma said, her voice a calm, chilling whisper. "I'll see you at the meeting, Victoria. I wouldn't miss it for the world." She turned and walked up the stairs, leaving the drawing room in a stunned, momentary silence. As she reached the landing, she heard Victoria's voice rise again, dismissive and loud. "The audacity of that girl. James, remind me to have the locks changed the moment she's served." Emma entered her room and closed the door. She didn't turn on the light. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the property deed from her bag, running her thumb over the official seal. The rough texture was the only thing that felt real in this house of cards. 48 hours. The cage was built. The bait was set. And Victoria Anderson was currently celebrating a victory in a war she had already lost. Emma looked at the clock on her bedside table. The seconds ticked away, each one a heartbeat closer to the moment the Andersons would realize that the woman they treated as a servant was actually the one who owned the air they breathed. Victoria's silk robe hissed against the hardwood floors as she swept into the guest room. The scent of her expensive, cloying lily perfume preceded her, a sharp contrast to the faint smell of crayon and lavender that always clung to Emma's clothes. Victoria didn't knock. She never did. She stood in the center of the room, her eyes raking over the modest suitcase lying open on the bed. "I see you've started," Victoria said, her voice thin and sharp like a paper cut. "Smart girl. I've already contacted the charity shop to pick up whatever you leave behind. I won't have this room cluttered with whatever it is you call a wardrobe." Emma Montgomery didn't look up from the book she was tucking into a side pocket. Her fingers were steady, tracing the spine of the old leather volume. "I'm only taking what's mine, Victoria." "Which is next to nothing," Victoria laughed, a brittle sound that lacked any genuine warmth. She reached out, flicking the collar of Emma's beige cardigan with a manicured nail. James told me he bought you this for your birthday last year. Technically, it's Anderson property, but keep it. Consider it a parting gift for your service." Emma finally met her gaze. She didn't flinch. She didn't show the white-hot spark of anger that usually would have flared behind her ribs. Instead, she felt a strange, cold pity. "You should be careful, Victoria. The things you think you own have a way of disappearing when the light changes." Victoria's brow furrowed for a fraction of a second, her arrogance momentarily snagged on the quiet confidence in Emma's voice. Then she smoothed her expression, a dismissive smirk returning. "Is that a threat? From a kindergarten teacher? Please, you're lucky we aren't charging you back rent for the last 5 years." She turned on her heel, her gaze landing on a small ceramic vase Emma had placed on the nightstand, a gift from one of her students. With a casual, practiced motion, Victoria swept her hand across the surface. The vase hit the floor, shattering into a dozen jagged pieces. "Oops," Victoria whispered, mirroring her own cruelty from the dinner the night before. "I'll have the maid sweep that up, or perhaps you should do it. One last chore for the family." She vanished back into the hallway, her laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Emma waited until the sound died away. She knelt, picking up a single blue shard. The edges were sharp, drawing a tiny bead of crimson from her thumb. She didn't feel the sting. She felt the weight of the phone in her pocket. She stepped into the ensuite and locked the door, the click of the bolt sounding like a hammer cocking. She dialed a number she knew by heart. "Sterling," a voice answered on the second ring. Michael Sterling sounded exactly like he looked, expensive, precise, and dangerous. "It's Emma," she said, her voice dropping into the low, authoritative tone she used when she wasn't playing the part of the dutiful daughter-in-law. "Is the audit complete?" "Every cent, Emma. James and his mother have been bleeding the trust dry to maintain the estate. They've leveraged assets they don't even legally hold. It's a mess of signatures and forged authorizations. And the Rockefeller gala tomorrow. The invitation list is finalized. Harrison Rockefeller specifically asked if you would be attending. He's under the impression you're the primary contact for the Montgomery Foundation's new scholarship fund." Emma looked at her reflection in the mirror. The modest teacher was still there, but the eyes belonged to the woman who had built a tech empire before she was 30. "Let him keep that impression. I want the transfer of title served publicly, not in a lawyer's office. I want them to hear it when the rest of the world does." "It's aggressive," Sterling noted, though she could hear the grin in his voice. "I like it. I'll have the documents ready by 7 tomorrow evening." "Thank you, Michael." Emma ended the call and walked back into the bedroom. She ignored the shattered ceramic on the floor. She walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling gardens of the Anderson estate. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawn. James was down there, practicing his golf swing, looking every bit the prince of a kingdom that was currently crumbling beneath his feet. He looked up, catching her eye, and quickly looked away, his shoulders hunching in a display of cowardice that no longer hurt her. She had given him a dozen chances to stand up for her. She had given Victoria 100 chances to show a shred of humanity. The time for chances was over. The countdown had reached its final 24 hours. Tomorrow night, the Andersons wouldn't just be losing a daughter-in-law. They would be losing the ground they stood on. Emma pulled a fresh silk dress from the back of the closet, midnight blue, hidden behind her plain teaching clothes. She ran her hand over the fabric. It felt like cold water. It felt like victory. The air in the Anderson ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of vintage champagne. Crystal chandeliers vibrated with the low, rhythmic thrum of a string quartet, casting fractured light over a sea of black ties and floor-length gowns. At the center of the room, Victoria Anderson stood like a queen holding court, her neck draped in diamonds that caught every flash of the photographer's bulbs. She was in her element, her voice a practiced trill of artificial warmth as she greeted the city's elite. "It's for such a tragic cause, really," Victoria said, leaning toward a group of socialites. She gestured vaguely toward the stage where several antique oil paintings were displayed. "The Montgomery estate was practically in ruins before we stepped in to manage the liquidation. It's a shame when old families lose their grip on reality, but at least their misfortune can fund our new wing at the gallery. James Anderson stood at her elbow, his smile tight and his eyes darting toward the entrance. He looked polished in his tuxedo, but the way his fingers drummed against his champagne flute betrayed a restlessness he couldn't hide. He hadn't spoken to his wife since the previous evening, and the silence was clearly beginning to grate on his nerves. "She isn't coming, Mother," James whispered, leaning close to Victoria. "I told you she was making some ridiculous stand about family values. Let's just get through the auction." Victoria didn't even look at him. "She'll do as she's told, James. If she wants to keep living under this roof, she'll show up and play the part of the grateful daughter-in-law. Although," she paused, her lip curling in a sneer, "perhaps it's better if she stays in that drafty apartment of hers. She doesn't exactly have the wardrobe for an event of this caliber. I won't have her embarrassing us in front of the Rockefellers." A sudden hush rippled through the foyer, a wave of silence that traveled from the heavy oak doors toward the center of the ballroom. Heads turned, and the rhythmic clinking of silverware died away. Emma Montgomery stepped into the light. The midnight blue silk of her dress moved like liquid ink, catching the light in deep, shimmering folds that made her skin look like alabaster. It wasn't a dress one bought off a rack. It was a masterpiece of tailoring that whispered of secret ateliers and five-figure price tags. Her hair was swept up, exposing the elegant line of her throat, and her gaze was steady, cool, and entirely unrecognizable to the woman who had spent years shrinking into the shadows of the Anderson estate. She didn't look for James. She didn't look for approval. She walked with the effortless grace of someone who owned the floor beneath her heels. Victoria's glass paused midair. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the newcomer with the predatory instinct of a social lioness. "Who is that?" she murmured, her voice sharpening. "James, who invited a woman like that without clearing it with me?" James didn't answer. His mouth had gone dry, his eyes fixed on the woman approaching them. "Emma," he breathed, the word barely a ghost of a sound. Emma Montgomery stopped 3 feet from them. The scent of her perfume, something rare, earthy, and expensive, cut through the cloying lilies. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer a smile. She simply stood there, a silent challenge in every line of her posture. "You're late," Victoria snapped, recovering her composure even as her face flushed a blotchy red. She stepped forward, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "And where did you get that? Did you put it on a credit card James gives you? That dress is worth more than your yearly teaching salary, you arrogant little girl. You think putting on a costume makes you one of us." "I think," Emma said, her voice calm and resonant, "that you have a very limited understanding of what I am capable of, Victoria." "Don't you use that tone with me," Victoria growled. She reached out, her fingers hovering near Emma's shoulder as if to shove her away. "You look like a high-end escort who wandered into the wrong party. Take it off and leave before I have security escort you out for theft. I know you didn't buy this. People like you don't even know the names of the designers who make fabric this fine." The surrounding guests began to whisper, their eyes darting between the two women. Rachel Anderson stood a few feet away, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her clutch bag. She knew. She saw the way Emma held herself, and she saw the storm gathering on the horizon. Before Victoria could launch into another tirade, a heavy, authoritative voice boomed from the edge of the circle. "Emma, is that truly you?" Harrison Rockefeller stepped through the crowd, his silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers. The patriarch of the city's oldest fortune ignored Victoria entirely, his eyes fixed on Emma with genuine warmth and a touch of professional deference. He reached out, taking Emma's hand and bowing slightly, a gesture he reserved only for his equals. "Harrison," Emma said, her voice softening just a fraction. "It's been too long." "I was told you were traveling," Harrison said, his voice carrying clearly to the stunned witnesses. "My board was quite disappointed when you declined the invitation to the summit in Zurich. We've been waiting for your signature on the merger for weeks." Victoria's jaw literally dropped. She looked from Harrison to Emma, her brain struggling to reconcile the charity case daughter-in-law with the woman being treated like royalty by the most powerful man in the room. "Harrison, surely there's a mistake," Victoria stammered, her voice high and brittle. "This is just James's wife. She's a school teacher." Harrison Rockefeller turned his gaze toward Victoria, his expression cooling instantly. "A school teacher. Victoria, I think your son has married the most brilliant venture capitalist of her generation. Emma Montgomery is the reason my firm is still solvent this quarter." He turned back to Emma, ignoring Victoria's strangled gasp. "Are you here for the auction? I assume you're looking to buy back the family heirlooms the Andersons were so gracious to put on the block." Emma's gaze flicked to Victoria, whose face had gone from red to a deathly, waxen gray. The face slap hadn't even landed yet, but the sting was already visible. "I'm not here to buy them back, Harrison," Emma said, her voice like a velvet blade. "I'm here to see who thinks they're important enough to bid on my property." The auctioneer's gavel rapped sharply at the front of the room, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The main event is about to begin." Emma felt the weight of the flash drive in her clutch. The one Michael Sterling had confirmed was ready to go. She looked at James, who was staring at her as if she were a stranger, and then at Victoria, whose hand was shaking so violently that champagne slopped over the rim of her glass, staining her white silk glove. "Shall we?" Emma asked, her smile finally appearing, a cold, predatory thing. She turned and walked toward the front row, leaving the Andersons standing in the wake of her shadow. The countdown had hit 0. The room was full of witnesses, and the first item on the block was about to cost Victoria Anderson everything she ever loved. Emma took her seat in the velvet-lined front row, the air around her thick with the scent of aged mahogany and the heavy, floral perfume of women who bought their significance at events like these. She could feel the gaze of the room on her back, 1,000 needles of curiosity and disdain. Victoria Anderson leaned over, her shoulder brushing Emma's. The white silk of her glove was still damp where the champagne had spilled, but her voice was as dry as bone. "I don't know what little game you think you're playing, Emma Montgomery, but sitting in the front row won't make you one of us. You're a tourist in a world you can't afford to breathe in." She gestured dismissively toward the stage. "That estate up there, it's been in the Anderson name for 3 generations. Its legacy, its power, things a kindergarten teacher wouldn't understand." Emma didn't turn her head. She simply watched as the auctioneer, a stout man with a voice that cut through the room like a rusted blade, stepped to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, we begin today with the crown jewel of the Anderson holdings, the Willow Creek estate." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. James Anderson shifted in his seat 2 rows back, his eyes fixed on the floor, while Harrison Rockefeller adjusted his spectacles, his expression unreadable. "Opening bid is 10 million, the auctioneer announced. Emma raised a single finger, not for a bid but as a signal. In the shadows near the tech booth, Michael Sterling caught her eye and nodded. He slid the silver flash drive into the terminal. "Wait," Emma said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a crystalline clarity that caused the auctioneer to freeze mid-sentence. The massive digital screen behind the podium flickered. The picturesque image of the rolling hills and the white-columned manor vanished, replaced by a stark, black-and-white legal document. It was a notice of seizure, stamped with the seal of the High Court and the logo of Montgomery Global. "The property isn't for sale," Emma continued, her tone conversational, almost bored. "Because the Andersons no longer own it. I bought the underlying debt 6 months ago through a subsidiary." The foreclosure was finalized at 4 o'clock today. The room plunged into a silence so absolute it felt physical. Victoria's transformation was visceral. The smug, porcelain mask she'd worn for decades didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Her skin, once flushed with the triumph of her social standing, drained to a sickly, grayish pallor that made her expensive foundation look like a death mask. Her eyes, usually sharp and predatory, bulged with a frantic, uncomprehending terror, darting toward the screen as if she could wish the legal documents away. Her mouth hung open, a jagged, silent O of ruin, while her lower lip began a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor that betrayed the absolute collapse of her composure. The sweat began to bead at her hairline, matting the perfectly coiffed blonde strands as the realization hit her. The ground she stood on was no longer hers. Harrison Rockefeller leaned forward, a sharp, calculating glint in his eyes as he studied the document on the screen. He let out a low, appreciative whistle that carried in the quiet. James looked as if he had been struck, his face buried in his hands. Beside him, Rachel Anderson gasped, her hand flying to her throat as she looked at Emma with a mixture of terror and dawning respect. The socialites in the rows behind them began to pull away, their chairs scraping against the floor as they physically distanced themselves from the woman who had just become a social pariah. "You," Victoria choked out, her voice a thin, ragged ghost of its former self. "You can't. That's my home." Emma stood up, smoothing the front of her dress. She looked down at the woman who had spent years trying to crush her spirit. "You spent so much time looking down at me, Victoria, that you forgot to look at the fine print on your own life. You wanted me to see what real legacy looks like. This is it. It's mine now." Emma didn't wait for the screaming to start, though she could see it building in the frantic rise and fall of her former mother-in-law's chest. She turned her back on the wreckage and walked toward the heavy oak exit doors, her heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the marble. She had delivered the truth. Now, she would let the silence finish the job. Victoria's voice cracked the silence of the ballroom, a shrill, desperate sound that lacked its usual practiced elegance. She lunged forward, her hand catching the edge of a mahogany display table so hard the crystal vase atop it rattled, the water sloshing over the sides like a sinking ship. "Those documents are fraudulent. Emma, you pathetic little girl, do you really think you can walk into my home and perform this? This theater?" Emma Montgomery stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She let the weight of the silence settle, punctuated only by the frantic, uneven breathing of the woman behind her. When she finally pivoted, her expression wasn't one of anger, but of a chilling, clinical detachment. The scent of the expensive white lilies decorating the hall, which had felt like a celebration an hour ago, now hung in the air with the cloying heaviness of a funeral. "It stopped being your home the moment you signed the predatory loan agreement with Montgomery Holdings 3 years ago," Emma said. Her voice was low, carrying effortlessly through the hushed room. "You were so eager for the capital to maintain this facade that you didn't bother to check who sat on the board of the company lending it to you. You were so blinded by the sparkle of the Montgomery name that you never realized I was the one who owned it." Michael Sterling stepped into the light of the crystal chandelier, his leather briefcase clicking open with a sound like a pistol cocking. He produced a sleek tablet, swiping a finger to project a fresh set of images onto the large screen behind the podium. "For the benefit of the room," he announced, his tone devoid of emotion, "the digital ledger of the Anderson estate. As of 12 minutes ago, the foreclosure process is legally complete. The title has been transferred. My client is now the sole owner of this property and all its contents, including the very chair you are currently clutching for support." The room erupted in a wave of sharp, jagged whispers. James Anderson stood frozen at the periphery, his face a mask of cowardice. He looked at his mother, then at his wife, and for the first time in his life, he found no words to bridge the gap between them. He looked small, his expensive tailored suit suddenly appearing 2 sizes too large for his shrinking frame. Rachel Anderson, however, didn't stay silent. She moved away from her mother, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic retreat on the marble floor. "You knew," Rachel hissed at Victoria, her eyes wide with a mix of shame and realization. "You knew the finances were failing and you still spent Emma's money like it was water. You dragged us all into this lie." Harrison Rockefeller adjusted his cufflinks, his gaze sweeping over Victoria with the same clinical interest one might give a stain on an expensive rug. "It seems my invitation was issued under false pretenses," he said, his voice a cold blade that sliced through the remaining tension. "I have no business with those who build empires on borrowed sand. Emma, my dear, I believe we have much to discuss regarding the new tech corridor. My car is waiting outside." The socialites followed his lead with terrifying efficiency. It was a physical shifting of the tide. The rows of chairs scraped back as people who had kissed Victoria's cheek an hour ago now looked through her as if she were made of glass. They moved toward the exits, their whispers forming a shroud of social execution. The skin around Victoria's eyes seemed to lose its elasticity in real time, sagging into deep, dark hollows that hadn't been there moments before. Her perfectly applied crimson lipstick now looked like a jagged wound against her ghostly, ash-gray complexion. Her jaw hung slack, her lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch that betrayed the absolute shattering of her composure. The arrogance that usually held her shoulders high evaporated, leaving her frame slumped and brittle, as if the very bones of her social standing had turned to dust. She didn't just look defeated. She looked erased, a hollow shell of a woman whose entire identity had been tied to a lie that was now being stripped away in front of the very people she sought to impress. "James," Victoria choked out, reaching a trembling hand toward her son. "James, tell them she's lying. Tell them this is our house." James looked down at his polished shoes, his silence the final, crushing blow. He couldn't even meet her eyes. He was a man who had lived his life in the shadow of two powerful women, and he had finally been eclipsed by the one he had underestimated most. Emma walked back toward the podium, her presence filling the space Victoria had vacated. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at the woman who had spent years calling her a charity case and a nobody while living off her secret inheritance. "You have 30 days to vacate," Emma said, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Anything remaining after that will be cataloged and sold at a public estate sale. I've already contacted the auction house. They're particularly interested in the old money heirlooms you were so fond of bragging about. It turns out they'll fetch a fine price to cover your outstanding debts." "Where am I supposed to go?" Victoria whispered, her voice a thin, ragged ghost of its former self. "That is no longer my concern," Emma replied. She turned to Michael without a second glance at the wreckage. "Ensure the locks are changed on the wine cellar and the gallery tonight. I want a full inventory by morning. If anything is missing, file the police report immediately." She didn't wait for a response. Emma walked out of the ballroom, her heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the floor. As she reached the heavy oak doors, she felt the cool night air hit her face, crisp and clean. The weight of the Anderson name was gone, replaced by the solid, unshakable reality of her own. She stepped into the waiting car, leaving the crumbling empire behind her without a single look back. The silence in the house behind her was finally absolute, the sound of a legacy finally hitting the floor. 6 months had passed since the name Anderson had been stripped of its gold leaf luster and returned to the dusty ledgers of history. The transition had been surgical, a quiet restructuring of reality that left the city's socialites whispering for weeks before they moved on to fresher scandals. For Emma Montgomery, the silence was the most expensive thing she had ever bought, and it was worth every cent. She sat in her new office at the Montgomery Foundation, a space that smelled of lemon polish and old books rather than the stifling, heavy lilies of the Anderson estate. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city looked different, clearer somehow. She wasn't looking down on it from a pedestal. She was finally a part of it. A sharp rap at the door preceded Michael Sterling. He looked more relaxed than he had during the weeks of the takeover, his sharp suits replaced by a softer charcoal wool. He placed a leather-bound folder on her desk, the heavy weight of the documents making a satisfying thud against the mahogany. "The last of the liquidations is complete," he said, his voice carrying a hint of professional pride. "The Anderson Gallery was auctioned off yesterday. The proceeds have already been transferred to the literacy program for the new community centers." Emma leaned back, her fingers tracing the cool edge of a silver fountain pen. "And the family." Michael adjusted his glasses. "James is in Chicago. He's working a mid-level analyst job for a firm that doesn't know his history. From what I hear, he's living in a corporate apartment and spends most of his time trying to avoid his mother's phone calls. He's become quite the ghost." Emma felt a flicker of something, Not quite pity, but a hollow recognition of the man she had once loved. He had chosen the shadow of his mother's approval, and now he was living in a shadow of his own making. The betrayal still tasted like iron in the back of her throat if she thought about it too long, a reminder that her innocence had been the first thing she'd sacrificed to win. "And Victoria?" Emma asked, her voice steady. Michael's expression shifted into something colder. "Victoria Anderson is currently employed at a temp agency in the garment district. She's working as a receptionist for a wholesale textile firm. It's a far cry from the front row of Fashion Week." Emma thought of Victoria's face on that final night, the way her skin had turned the color of wet parchment when the truth was revealed. She pictured her now, sitting behind a laminate desk, answering phones for people she would have previously deemed unworthy of her breath. The rage that had fueled Emma for months didn't flare up. Instead, it settled into a cold, hard satisfaction. The woman who had mocked Emma's knockoff, life was now wearing mass-produced polyester and counting down the minutes until her lunch break. Later that afternoon, Emma met Rachel Anderson at a small, unassuming cafe near the park. The rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine and the low hum of student chatter provided a backdrop of normalcy that Emma found grounding. Rachel looked older, the lines around her eyes more pronounced, but she carried herself with a new, quiet dignity. "I saw her yesterday," Rachel said, staring into the dark depths of her coffee. "Victoria. She was standing at a bus stop on 42nd Street. She was wearing a coat that was pilling at the sleeves, Emma. She looked small. Did you speak to her?" Rachel shook her head. "She saw me and turned away. The pride is still there, rotting away at her. She'd rather stand in the rain than admit she needs help from the sister she used to call a disappointment." She looked up, her gaze searching Emma's face. "Are you happy, Emma?" Emma looked out the window at the children playing in the park. She thought of the kindergarten classroom she still visited twice a week, the simple joy of finger paints and story time. She thought of the foundation, the millions of dollars she was funneling into lives that actually mattered. "I'm at peace," Emma replied. "But happiness is a different thing. It's quieter than I thought it would be." The cost of her victory was written in the spaces where her family used to be. She had saved herself, but she had lost the version of herself that believed people were inherently good. She was Emma Montgomery now, a woman of substance and steel, but the girl who had married James for love was a casualty of the war. As she walked back to her car, the sharp autumn wind nipped at her cheeks. She passed a construction site where the old Anderson Library, a cold, private monument to ego, was being gutted to make room for a public learning center. The sound of the jackhammers was like music, the sound of something old and broken being cleared away for something new. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, crinkled drawing a student had given her that morning. It was a sun, bright and yellow, bleeding off the edges of the paper. She tucked it into her expensive leather portfolio, right next to the liquidation reports. The victory was hers, and the empire was gone, but as she drove away from the wreckage of the past, she knew the real work was just beginning. The lion was no longer sleeping. She was simply choosing her own path.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.